It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. President Trump's new choice to head the IRS has received little notice, but could be highly consequential. Trump has tapped David Cotter, a person with no IRS background. Instead, Cotter was previously employed at Ernst & Young, an accounting firm known for its tax avoidance strategies. Joining me is Dean Baker, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Welcome, Dean. Tell us who David Cotter is.
Yeah, a couple points. First off, what's really important to emphasize here is that he is an interim head. He'll be the acting director. The reason why I'm emphasizing that is that means there's no congressional scrutiny. There will be no hearings. He doesn't have to go through any nomination process. So there's no opportunity for members of either party to ask him questions, ask him how he will treat various issues. So this is really extraordinary. I mean, presidents of both parties in the past have selected people, nominated people to be directors, so they undergo that scrutiny. And then the flip side, he also has no background in tax enforcement. As you said, he'd been at Ernst & Young, he headed their tax division. This is a division that is there to engage in tax avoidance, in principle, legal tax avoidance, but the idea is to minimize the tax bills of their clients. And they went so far that Ernst & Young had to pay a fine of, they probably didn't call it a fine, they had to pay $123 million in a settlement to avoid criminal prosecution. So this is a guy that's about tax avoidance, and that should have people concerned, because we could have any tax law we want. We can pay 90% in taxes, but if the IRS isn't enforcing it, tax rate's zero, and that's what we have to worry about.
But Dean, if he's only an interim director, how long could he really be there for, and how much damage could he really do?
You could do a huge amount. Basically, it's not clear. I mean, the precedent here, the comptroller of the currency is also an interim appointment. He was only supposed to be able to serve, I believe, it was 120 days. We're now up to 190 days. No one is doing anything. In this case, I believe it would be 180 days that he legally would be allowed to serve. But that's enforced by Congress. And at the moment, at least, you have Republicans who control Congress who really don't seem to care about the law. You know, the joke is that they say rich people need tax cuts and they aren't going to let anything stand in the way.
Last year, it was reported that IRS audits had declined for the 5th year in a row. What's going on with that?
Well, the Republicans have engaged in an effort to gut IRS enforcement for really 2 decades. This dates back to the Clinton years. The Gingrich Congress was making a big issue of the IRS being abusive in their enforcement efforts, and they cut back funding for enforcement, so that funding has been way down. They are happy to appropriate funding to review earned income tax applications for the earned income tax credit, which at the end of the day, I mean, you don't want to see fraud anywhere, but the earned income tax credit maxes them out at around $5,000. If someone is making millions a year and potentially owes hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars to the IRS, that's a big deal, and that's where they want to have cutbacks. I should also point out one very specific issue that has already come before the IRS and is likely to be relevant with the new director here, acting director, Robert Mercer, the very conservative billionaire. He has a hedge fund, Renaissance Technologies, that was ruled to be in violation of the tax code, $7 billion in back taxes and penalties. That is still up for debate, for final resolution. There's a real concern that David Cotter will just give them a green light and say, oh, forget about that. And that's a lot of money to Mr. Mercer. And needless to say, I suspect a substantial portion of that will come back to the Republican Party and other conservative organizations.
Right, and so finally, speaking of billionaires, we're speaking just as the Republicans are about to unveil their new tax plan. It was supposed to be today, but it's been delayed. Now, one aspect of it is this notion that cutting taxes for the rich and for corporations is going to lead to a huge boost in economic productivity, which will then increase the incomes of middle income people. Your thoughts on that as an economic theory?
Yeah, we've done this twice before. We did this with President Reagan. We did with President George W. Bush. There was no spurt of growth. And my friend Josh Biven at the Economic Policy Institute was just looking at very basic issues. It's a very fundamental point. I won't go into details here, but the basic story is that lower corporate tax rates are supposed to lead to this big boost in investment. And he looked at this, we were talking about, he looked, is there any evidence? We looked across country that countries with lower tax rates have more capital, more investment. He found the opposite. We're not going to say that lowering the tax rates will lower investment, but that's actually what he found. So, I mean, we aren't going to argue the causal relationship goes in that direction, but you sure can't look at the evidence and say it goes the other way, that lower tax rates will lead to more investment. The data is not there.
So, Dean, can you explain that? If corporations aren't spending the money on investment that boosts growth, what are they doing with the money?
Well, what they'd likely do is what they've been doing recently. They're going to pay it out either as dividends or as share buybacks. The basic story, and there's a lot of data to support this, is that corporations invest when they see a demand for their product. And we could have a big tax cut that's not going to create more demand for their product. So most likely this will end up as higher payments to shareholders as dividends, or they'll use it to have stock buybacks. Neither of those does any particular good for the economy. It might make their shareholders happy, but it's not going to help the rest of us.
They'll only invest if there's a market for people to purchase their goods and products and services. But if the economy is in the tank and people have no money and all the gains are going to the 1%, then no one's going to have money to be able to justify those investments.
If you look back over the history, the period in which we had strongest investment was actually the period of weakest profits. So in the late 1970s, when the post-war profit rate was pretty much at its all-time low, that was the period when we had the highest rate of investment. Then we get into the last decade when we've had very high profit rates, near or at the highest level of the post-war period, and investment's been weak. So the relationship, if anything, is the opposite. Again, I'm not going to say that high profits cause investment to be low, but as a practical matter, it clearly doesn't go the other way. High profits do not lead to more investment. We've researched that up the wazoo. That relationship doesn't exist.
It's striking how we don't hear that very often when we talk about investment and profits in the corporate media.
Well, that's true. And I think part of the story is we sort of would naively like to think that, okay, higher profits means firms will invest more, but it just turns out not to be the case. And again, a lot of people spend a lot of time looking at the evidence on that. I think you have to really beat it up hard to find anything different.
We'll leave it there. Dean Baker, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.